So I would now like to hand over the next session to Professor Kaysar Haq, the Dean of School of Arts and Humanities, who will be chairing this session to introduce the keynote speaker and also the session itself. So please welcome Professor Kaysar Haq.
Ladies and gentlemen, I appear once again before you. This time with the very pleasant, to perform the very pleasant task of introducing one of my former students who is now here at ULAB as a distinguished summer visiting professor. You will find a detailed personal statement in the brochure which touches upon Azfar's connection with Ngũgĩ. Regarding his designation, you see, I mean, this is de rigueur in any introduction. He studied at Dhaka University, taught at Jahangirnagar, went to America on the Fulbright, took a PhD from Washington, the University of Washington, Seattle, and he's now director of the graduate program in social innovation at Grand Valley State University, Michigan. He's also vice president and professor of English, world literature, and interdisciplinary studies at the Global Center for Advanced Studies, GCAS, New York. He has been always keenly interested in all innovations in literary studies. He's very curious about all kinds of theory. Now that can have a centrifugal effect, you see. So, but unless that centrifugal effect is counterbalanced by a centripetal force, one can just go, spinning around. So the centripetal force in his case is Marxism, whereas his curiosity has till now taken him to Derrida, Foucault, and others. Okay. Without further ado, let me welcome Azfar Hussain to the stage, and presently he will appear before you with his keynote address at this conference of ours.
Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me? Okay. Because sometimes I get this impression that I don't use this technology, but technology uses me. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, sir, for that interesting, warm, and generous introduction. And thanks to you all for being here. Is it bright and early or it's just early? I don't know. But your presence, which makes your presence even heroic in some ways. And I'm grateful to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Imran Rahman, for joining us today. And as for the chair of this keynote session, what can I say? I'm both honored and a little nervous, probably in the best way, to be speaking before someone who has been a towering figure in my intellectual life, my respected teacher, my all-time favorite poet, critic, translator, and a fabulous storyteller. in our adda. Many of you don't know this though. Only some do. I'm one of them. Professor Kaiser Haq. Thank you, sir, for gracing this session and keeping me on my best behavior. As you know by now, the title of my lecture this morning is Personal Encounters with Ngũgĩ, Emancipatory Theory, Creative Imagination, and the Conversations that Transformed Me. A bit of a mouthful, I admit, but then again, Ngũgĩ is not really a minimalist thinker, but when the moment calls for it, he can drop one-liner so goddamn sharp, it could slice through a colonial curriculum. Now, I have chosen 3 epigraphs to frame my talk this morning, all from Ngũgĩ himself, of course. I will share them with you in just a moment. The first is drawn from his final book, Decolonizing Language and Other Revolutionary Ideas, which was published on May 6, 2025, this very year, the very month Ngũgĩ passed away. He died on May 28. That fact alone gives the book the aura of a parting gift, a final flare of brilliance. And as Ngũgĩ tells us there, and I quote Ngũgĩ, the primary role of the writer, or more broadly, the artist, is to produce the healthiest material for the education of the imagination. Just as unhealthy food weakens the body and bad ethical choices diminish the spiritual, so also bad art can limit the imagination or direct it to unhealthy ends. That's why the arts should not be a luxury in the school system. They should be central to it. Even engineers, architects, urban planners, teachers, and scientists thrive on a robust imagination that can find links between phenomena, unquote. Of course, this is not the only time Ngũgĩ name-dropped engineers and urban planners in the same breath as novelists and poets. Now, my second epigraph is taken from Ngũgĩ's 2018 interview called Language is a War Zone. And he puts it this way, I quote Ngũgĩ again, I don't really believe it when a writer says, oh, I'm not writing about politics. Really they are, because they are espousing a view of the world consciously or unconsciously. Writers need to be aware that they are not neutral agents. The scars of history are on every writer, unquote. And now to my third or last epigraph, this time from his 2014 book called Globalectics, the politics of knowing, where Ngũgĩ sketches a vision of intellectual and cultural interconnectedness. And I quote Ngũgĩ here, the term globalectics is derived from the shape of the globe. Globalectics embraces wholeness, interconnectedness, equality of potentiality of parts, tension and motion. It is a way of thinking and relating to the world, particularly in the era of globalism and globalization, unquote. The term globalectics obviously brings together the global and the dialectical, and it is Ngũgĩ's neologism, one that I find very significant. So there you have it, 3 guiding stars for this morning's journey, the emancipatory force of art and the radical rethinking of how we engage the world. So I first met Ngũgĩ Thiong'o back in 2005 at Washington State University in the US, where I taught for more than a decade and where I had the pleasure and the slightly nerve-wracking honor of introducing Ngũgĩ to a packed auditorium. With no shortage of enthusiasm, I offered an overview of his extraordinary life and work as he prepared to deliver a lecture titled The Role of a Scholar in the Post-Colonial World. Yes, there is an online version of it floating around. If you're interested, you might want to check it out. So after the lecture, we did what comrades in thought probably do best. We talked, and then talked some more. What emerged from that initial conversation was a surprising and delightful recognition of shared ground. Not just in our mutual interest in Marxism. Yes, I'm deeply interested in Marxism, unrepentantly. Ngũgĩ, I should note, identifies himself as a Marxist, quite matter-of-factly, but in our resonances around life, love, literature, politics, and even the occasional revolutionary mischief. Before long, we are calling each other comrade, without irony, but with much affection. So that first encounter marked the beginning of some substantive, even electric conversations between us, conversations surrounding decolonization, language, literature, translation, creativity, and the liberatory power of thought, drawing on those conversations and critically engaging with Ngũgĩ's theoretical contributions, particularly globalectics and the politics of knowing, and decolonizing language and other revolutionary ideas. I want to foreground Ngũgĩ not merely as a creative writer, which he undoubtedly is, but also as a politically grounded, philosophically serious, and relentlessly emancipatory theorist. Of course, while much critical attention has been paid to Ngũgĩ's fiction and drama, and of course to his classic work called Decolonizing the Mind, which appeared in 1986, his role as a theorist, particularly one rooted in anti-colonial and Marxist traditions, remains unfortunately under-examined. My conversations with Ngũgĩ, along with a sustained engagement with his non-fiction, reveal a thinker whose globalectical Marxism, I will talk about that a little later at more length, globalectical Marxism is inflected and invigorated by what I can only call an emancipatory imagination. He does not theorize from an ivory tower, but from the ground up, from the soil, the sentence, and the street. It is not for nothing. It is not for nothing that Ngũgĩ went to prison. I think I would do well to recount parenthetically some relevant facts here. In 1976, Ngũgĩ helped launch the Kamirutu Community Education and Cultural Center, a bold experiment in popular education and subaltern cultural production, rooted in the local idiom and collective memory. This was the Italian Marxist revolutionary Antonio Gramsci's organic intellectual work in action, theater of, by, and for the people. But the state, ever allergic to mass awakening, responded swiftly. Ngũgĩ's novel, Petals of Blood, and his radical play, I Will Marry When I Want, co-authored with Ngũgĩ wa Miri, so rattled the post-colonial bourgeoisie that Vice President Daniel Arap Moi ordered his arrest. His Marxist library, consisting as it did of Marx, Engels, and Lenin's books, was confiscated like contraband. Thrown into Committee maximum security prison without trial, Ngũgĩ endured what the Caribbean anti-colonial revolutionary Frantz Fanon would recognize as the brutal disciplining of the colonized intellectual who dares to revolt. Yet it was within that carceral space that Ngũgĩ reclaimed the word, writing Devil on the Cross, the first modern novel in Gikuyu on toilet paper. Even after release in 1978, the state denied him his teaching position and hounded his family, pushing him into exile. Like so many emancipatory thinkers, Ngũgĩ became what Gramsci might call a pessimist of the intellect, but optimist of the will, turning personal repression into collective expression, refusing to let the prison house of language or the prison cell of the state define the limits of imagination and emancipation. Ngũgĩ was an absolute master of the one-liner. At one point, he told me straight-faced, no less, and I quote Ngũgĩ here, "There's no emancipation without imagination," unquote. And then, without missing a beat, came another gem, and I quote, "There is no liberation without humor," unquote. As if to prove his point, he let out a thunderous guffaw. Naturally, I responded with a guffaw of my own, and together we managed to scandalize a quiet little bard in Moscow, not the one in Russia, mind you, but the one tucked away in the state of Idaho in the US. And just when I thought he would run out of epigrams, he delivered the knockout, and I quote Ngũgĩ here, "The deadliest enemy of love and life and laughter is capital, the ultimate villain," unquote. That line too was followed by laughter, but the kind that carries the weight of history and revolt. Let me return to the questions of imagination and creativity, which constituted a central theme in our conversation. Some of Ngũgĩ's most resonant ideas on creativity find striking articulation in the words of the Chicano Marxist poet Luis Rodriguez. And I quote Rodriguez here, "There abides in every person a reservoir of creativity that when tapped proves to be inexhaustible. As the saying goes, artists are not a special kind of person. Every person is a special kind of artist. There is nothing more powerful and transformative in a human being than an awakened heart, an engaged imagination, the clarity of purpose associated with conscious life activity." Excuse me. I should quickly mention here that I took notes during our conversation, and following each exchange, I jotted down even more reflections, afterthoughts, flashes of insight, and so on. So I'll be drawing on those notes to make further points about Ngũgĩ's work. It's both telling and rather delightful for me, of course, that the first topic Ngũgĩ and I explored during our conversation in Pullman, Washington, wasn't imagination, it wasn't creativity, or even storytelling, but theory. But theory, yes, theory, this supposedly dry, over-chewed, and often under-digested word that some creative writers dodge as if it were the literary equivalent of a tax audit. But not Ngũgĩ. Unlike those creative writers who waved the banner of pure, within quotation marks, pure creativity as a pretext to shun theory, perhaps fearing it might hurt their sense of aesthetic or linguistic hygiene, or even it might wrinkle their artistic robes, Ngũgĩ plunged head first into it. Though, to be fair, he was not one to sip the Kool-Aid of what the Egyptian cultural critic Masoud Zavarzadeh in his 1995 book called Postality once dubbed the postal cocktail, post-al, postal cocktail, postmodernist, post-structuralist, post-Marxist, post-colonial, post-national, post-imperial, post-humanist, post-dialectical, post-truth. Basically a post-everything stew seasoned with a whip of theoretical vertigo. Ngũgĩ and I shared a bemused suspicion of this post-all metropolis of theory, where jargon often stands in for justice and terminological gymnastics pirouette past material conditions. We both observed, with varying degrees of laughter and lament, how the postal turn tends to fetishize fragment over totality, aporia over contradiction, and the hyphenated self over the actual, embodied, exploited subject. As Ngũgĩ put it with a mischievous grin, I quote Ngũgĩ here, these days, even Helen's abduction and Madonna's navel piercing are getting the post-colonial treatment, unquote. Theory in this formulation risks becoming a high-end factory churning out over-coded analysis of anything and everything, often missing the forest for the hyper-textual tree. But let me be clear, and so was Ngũgĩ. He wasn't throwing theory under the proverbial matatu. Far from it. His own work, Globalectics, Globalectics, moving the center and decolonizing language and other revolutionary ideas are, among other things, theoretical works, unmistakably theoretical works, bold, systematic, and beautifully grounded in history, struggle, and the everyday. In fact, for Ngũgĩ, storytelling and theorizing are deeply interconnected. He theorizes by way of telling stories, and he tells stories by way of theorizing. In fact, for Ngũgĩ, this is a dynamic dialectic that characterizes his preoccupations with a number of issues that matter to him. Mark then what Ngũgĩ himself says about theory in Globalectics. I will quote Ngũgĩ at some length now. I quote Ngũgĩ, fiction, read storytelling also as theory. Fiction as theory. Can you in fact think of fiction, the novel, as writing theory? We have to go back to the original meaning of theory in Greek, theoria, meaning a view and a contemplation. View assumes a viewer, a ground on which to stand, and what is viewed from that standpoint. A view is also a framework for organizing what is seen and thinking about the viewed. Fiction is the original's theory. Confronted with an environment that they could not always understand, humans invented stories to explain it. The understanding of nature begins with its personification. The very origins of the universe are explained in myths and stories. Egyptian, Yoruba, Greek, Chinese, and Indian mythologies explain the multifaceted forces of nature by giving them dynamic personalities derived from the way they manifest themselves to the human. Classical orators of all societies have stories of the why, how, when, and what of the phenomenon of nature. How the leopard got its spots, how the dog came to live with humans, why people die, etc., unquote. So Ngũgĩ was not by any means interested in abolition theory, although at one point it was true he was interested in abolishing the English department, which caused, a tremendous amount of, debate and all kinds of hullaballoos at that point in time in history. But Ngũgĩ is interested in rescuing theory in some ways from what he saw as its drift into elite esoterica. He reminded me more than once, and with the kind of conviction only Ngũgĩ can carry, that we all theorize. We all theorize, whether we are peasants or playwrights, revolutionaries or readers. The point for him was to make theory walk with the people, even serve the people in their struggles for living, for life, liberation, or even emancipation, however grand it might sound, but not float over their heads in helium-filled prose. And that's what made our dialogue not just intellectually stimulating, but politically charged and even joyfully irreverent. Theory for Ngũgĩ was neither a temple nor a toy, but a tool sharpened not for vanity, but for liberation. Now, I myself will make a few quick observations about theory. Theory is always already there, lurking in the wings or dancing center stage, casting shadows, shedding light, winking in hints and whispers across the whole terrain of our experience, of our practice. Even the fiercest denunciation of theory often ends up giving birth to. What else? More theory. The baby might be ugly, but still theory. Well, let's be clear, not all theories are created equal. Not all theories are created equal. Not all poems sing, and not all critics sting. Some theorists stroll in wearing name tags, fully spelled out across contexts and conjunctures. Others arrive cloaked in metaphor, speaking in tongues, suggestive, elusive, charged with nuance, or buried so deep they need excavation gear. Some theories rise in defense of human creativity and collective emancipation. Others smother critic with conceptual fog, turning poetry into a temple of metaphysics and demanding genuflection at the altar of abstraction. And then there are those theories that by silence or strategy extend a knowing nod to the ruling class, or worse, serve as the ideological butler, tray in hand. Yet not all is lost. In the hands of those who are creative among the oppressed, some theories become hammers, tools of resistance, blueprints for battle, and maps for liberation. So before we cheerfully reject all theory in the name of pure practice or raw experience, let's pause and ask the seemingly inconvenient but significant, perhaps useful questions. Whose theory? Theory of what? Emerging from where? In service of whom? And with what consequences? Because the point, after all, is not to theorize the world endlessly, but to do something, whatever we can do, to change something in it at least. And yes, preferably with style. It's precisely here that Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o locates his own Marxism, a Marxism that cannot be casually dismissed as Western. His is a historically rooted, politically committed tradition of black Marxism, drawing on a constellation of revolutionary thinkers, W.E.B. Du Bois, the towering African-American theorist and activist, Aimé Césaire, the poetic voice of Caribbean Marxism, C.L.R. James, the radical historian and cricket-loving revolutionary, Frantz Fanon, the psychiatrist of colonization's violence, and the revolutionary theorist of liberation. African revolutionaries like Amilcar Cabral and Kwame Nkrumah, and in our own times, the unrelenting black feminist Marxist Angela Davis. And this is a Marxism that refuses dogma. And this is a Marxism that refuses and resists doxa. And this is not a Marxism of brittle formulae or fossilized slogans. It breathes, it sings, it moves through a living dialectic between the universal and the particular, between struggle and dream, between the hard edge of critique and the soft flame of hope. This is a Marxism tempered by the blues, sharpened by resistance, and kindled in the fires of black radical imagination. Ngũgĩ himself speaks to this fusion of thought and vision in Globalectics thus, and I quote Ngũgĩ again, Marx made me reflect on many things, including my conception of history and narrative practice. I started in a conscious way to seek connections in phenomena even in the seemingly unconnected. He challenged the linear development of history, the formative principle of my first two novels, The River Between and Weep Not Child, unquote. It was less a conversion than a revelation, a turning of the prism, a widening of the lens. And it's no coincidence that Ngũgĩ lifts up what he calls, and I quote, the dialectical African feminism, unquote, of Molara Ogunbibe, the Nigerian poet, critic, activist, feminist, and fierce advocate of rooted liberation. As Ngũgĩ writes, and I quote, her Marxist outlook has always been informed by critical feminist thought, which has roots in her upbringing, unquote. But I recall that moment in our 2005 conversation when Ngũgĩ said, I quote, theory without imagination is impoverished, unquote. A simple sentence, yes, but within it, entire galaxies turn. For Ngũgĩ, imagination is not an ornament to thought. It is its heartbeat, its compass, even its call to freedom. So, in his final work, Decolonizing Language and Other Revolutionary Ideas, Ngũgĩ declares, I quote Ngũgĩ again, the three central constituents of a human being are the body, the soul, and the imagination. He then sharpens the point, and I quote Ngũgĩ, there is one realm of our being without which there would be no difference between humans and the rest of nature, unquote. No, there is more. I'm talking of imagination. Ngũgĩ, I continue to quote Ngũgĩ here. I'm talking of imagination. Imagination is central to the survival of humans as humans. We have seen how an oppressive social system, or rulers in general, rulers in our own country, try to limit our imagination to make people unable to imagine and therefore to struggle for a different future, unquote. For Ngũgĩ, the ability to envision what doesn't exist is nothing short of revolutionary. It's not for nothing that James Joyce actually at one point went to the extent of defining, poetry as a rebellious activity, always in conflicts with the existing order of things, or the existing order of language for that matter. So, as Ngũgĩ insists, I quote, our capacity to imagine a different future is important for our liberation, for our emancipation. Without imagination, there would be no songs, no poetry, no fiction, and no prophecy, and of course, no emancipation, unquote. Emancipation then, for Ngũgĩ, is not simply a political or economic project. It is not simply a political or economic project, it is fundamentally an imaginative one, a creative project. Literature for Ngũgĩ is not a passive mirror, but an active force capable of producing an emancipatory consciousness that operates across multiple dimensions of human experience. In 2005, in our conversation, Ngũgĩ and I also delved into the question of creativity. Creativity as the praxis of imagination. For both of us, creativity is not some sacred turf reserved for a privileged priesthood of painters, poets, sculptors, architects, and the like. Sure, they are creative. No argument there. But as we agreed, creativity runs through the full spectrum of human experience, the whole gamut of lived human practices. Often, sometimes you see creativity in the most unexpected places. History, after all, shows that one can be brilliantly creative, not just as a poet or a pianist, but also as a mechanic, a mathematician, a manager, a farmer, a teacher, a cook, a shopkeeper, even dare I say, as a proofreader or an accountant. Yes, that budget spreadsheet might just be a hidden masterpiece. Who knows? One can do all kinds of things with that one. The great Latin American writer, historian, essayist, Eduardo Galeano, whose prose crackles with audacity and style, makes this point beautifully in his book called Mirrors. It's a dazzling series of vignettes that captures the startling ubiquity of creativity across time and cultures, reminding us, in essence, that nothing human is alien to the creative impulse. At one point, then, our conversation veered into the tangled terrain of post-independence politics in the global South, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Bangladesh naturally came up. Even back in 2005, I described to Ngũgĩ what I saw as some of the defining, though deeply entangled trends in Bangladesh's political culture. I laid them out in a kind of grim but rhythmic taxonomy. Number one, the commercialization of politics and the politicization of commerce. Number two, the bureaucratization of politics and the politicization of bureaucracy. Number three, the militarization of politics and the politicization of the military. Number four, the communalization of politics and the politicization of religion. And number five, borrowing the razor-sharp phrase of Badruddin Umar, I quote, the criminalization of politics and the politicization of criminals, unquote. In short, I said the country is effectively run by a tight orchestra of politicians, bureaucrats, and big business moguls, all playing from the same so-called neoliberal score. Ngũgĩ nodded, smiled knowingly, and said something like, sounds familiar. He promptly referred me to his own book called Writing Against Neocolonialism, which he said had tried to chart similar dynamics in post-colonial Kenya. That book still strikes me as uncannily relevant. Ngũgĩ was not familiar with the Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz's Suve Azadi, Dawn of Freedom, in English translation, Dawn of Freedom, that iconic Urdu poem mourning the betrayal of independence. But part of Writing Against Neocolonialism reads like a theoretical cousin to Faiz's lament. Like Faiz, Ngũgĩ insists that the promised dawn has not yet arrived for the new national elites still entangled in the web of what Iqbal Ahmed memorably calls the pathology of power, continue to produce the same old structures of domination, to say the least. As expected, Ngũgĩ summoned his two intellectual giants, Marx and Fanon, to underscore how the class struggle persists into the so-called post-independence period and how decolonization, contrary to the headlines, remains an unfinished and even uneven project. In fact, the very first Fanon quote he read out to me might well have been lifted from a daily newspaper in Dhaka. And the quote is this: scandals are numerous, ministers grow rich, their wives doll themselves up, the members of parliament feather their nests, and there is not a soul down to the simple policeman or the customs officer who does not join in the great procession of corruption, unquote. After that round of political exchange, we pivoted toward literature, our lifeline, focusing on voices from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It was Ngũgĩ who brought up Rabindranath Tagore, invoking his defense of the mother tongue as a powerful weapon during and after colonialism. Ngũgĩ had even quoted Rabindranath in Ngũgĩ's book called Detained, a writer's prison diary. I, in turn, introduced him to Qazi Nazrul Islam. Unsurprisingly, Ngũgĩ hadn't heard of Nazrul then. Yes, Nazrul is criminally under-translated into English. So I gave him a crash course in Nazrul 101. After listening closely, Ngũgĩ beamed and declared with characteristic warmth and solidarity, Nazrul is a Kenyan poet. We laughed, but it wasn't just a sentimental gesture. That Nazrul could sound Kenyan, that his verses could resonate across oceans and continents was no accident. It wasn't about mistaken identity. It was about shared struggle. Yes, Nazrul is decisively a Bangla poet, but he's also more than that. He is an internationalist. He is the only major Bangla poet to have emerged from the rural poor, and his words throb with the pulse of the oppressed everywhere. As the Caribbean Marxist C.L.R. James might say, Nazrul embodies a universalism from below, that the kind that travels not by airplane or empire, but by resistance, rhythm, and revolutionary hope. Our conversations, of course, covered far more ground than I can recount here, but given time constraints and my desire not to test your patience, I'll be now more selective. I've already been selective. So let me now quickly pivot to my final point. Even before 2005, I'd been quietly incubating a theory, one shaped by years of reading anti-colonial thinkers and writers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, writers, for instance, from Gabriel Garcia Marquez to Ngũgĩ Thiong'o himself. The core of this theory is quite straightforward. You simply can't understand. You simply can't understand how colonialism and imperialism, especially in their enduring entanglement with capitalism, obtain and operate without paying attention to, without grappling with four foundational material sides of both oppression and opposition, domination and defiance: land, labor, language, and the body. In other words, colonial conquest is not just a cartographic exercise. It is about expropriated land, exploited labor, silenced languages, and violated bodies. And so is resistance. The revolution, as I like to, it's a grand word, I know it's a devil term, I know, but still we speak of the revolution, we dream of the revolution, it's still there. So the revolution, as I like to half joke, won't be tweeted, but it will be rooted in these four sites I have just mentioned. Ngũgĩ, deeply influenced by Frantz Fanon, insists that decolonization is not a metaphor. It is the return of land, the liberation of labor, the rebirth of the body, and the reclamation of the world. In other words, we are not here just to interpret the world. Of course, to interpret the world is an important task, an important activity. We are here to rename it, reclaim it, and radically remake it. Indeed, one cannot read Ngũgĩ's work in totality and adequately and meaningfully without paying attention to those four sides, such as, again, labor, land, language, and the body. Let me elaborate on this a little bit, just a little bit. A little bit elaboration is still needed. Labor. Let me take up the question of labor. Labor under colonial capitalism is not just exploited but racialized, coerced, and geographically anchored. From African plantations, Ngũgĩ speaks of African plantations and Kenyan plantations and so on in a number of his works. So from African plantations to South Asian states, laboring bodies were stripped of dignity and treated as disposable tools of imperial profit. Ngũgĩ, like his theoretical and ideological guru, Frantz Fanon, emphasizes how value is extracted through the dehumanization of racialized workers, especially peasants, challenging those Eurocentric notions that privilege the industrial proletariat. Now the question of land. Land is more than property. It's memory, sustenance, and sovereignty. Colonialism begins with land seizure, converting sacred territory into commodity and plantation. From Bengal to Algeria to Kenya, the theft of land meant the destruction of life world. As Ngũgĩ, invoking Fanon again, argues, decolonization must begin with the return of land. Liberation then is rooted in reclaiming what was violently expropriated. And then language. Language serves as both a weapon and a wound of empire. Colonial regimes imposed European languages as superior, suppressing indigenous tongues and knowledge systems. Yet language also becomes a site of rebellion, reclaimed and resignified by poets like Amos Cesar, Qazi Nazrul Islam, and then the Latin American testimonial tradition. Language, as Ngũgĩ insists, carries memory and resistance, not just grammar. The body, finally, is the most intimate site of colonial control. Empire marks and mutilates the colonized body, extracting labor, imposing racial meaning, and regulating sexuality. Ngũgĩ reveals how the colonized subject is reduced to objecthood, fetishized, surveilled, violated. Yet the body can also become revolutionary, rising, organizing, and reclaiming its humanity. Taken together, these four interlinked sites form what might be called a theory of colonial racial capitalism, one that not only diagnoses systems of domination, but also points towards the embodied land-based and language-driven practices of resistance that continue across the global south today, broadly speaking. Now, here's another thing. Ngũgĩ Thiong'o was not primarily a poet. He has written some poems. You know, I haven't enjoyed them though, but he has attempted. He has written poems primarily in his own language, his native Gikuo, most notably The Perfect Nine, the epic of Gikuo and Mumbi, a book-length prose poem published in 2020. This epic reimagines the Gikuo myth, blending oral tradition with literary innovation. Let me close with Ngũgĩ's own pronouncements that resonate with timeless defiance, so to speak. The truth they tried to shoot down with bullets. The truth they bound with handcuffs and shackles. The truth for which they threw you into jail and detention. The truth still lives forever among the people, in the hearts of all who fight for justice and freedom across the world. And the truth is this, you are not yet free. You are still in chains. So, la luta literaria, la luta continua. The struggle continues. Thank you. Thank you much for listening. If you have any questions or concerns, anything you...
Now, again, it's my very pleasant task to bring this session to a close. Many ideas have been projected, and I'm sure throughout the day, many of the issues raised here will be discussed and debated. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Warm thanks to the organizers, Arifa, Nadia, Mahmoud, Shamshad, for coming up with this idea. By the way, I don't know if everyone is familiar with the title of the conference, La Luta Literaria. No? Mamun Muntasir? No? La Luta Literaria, Ngũgĩ and the Battle for Language and Liberation. La Luta, the subtitle does not illuminate the title. The title simply means the literary struggle. It's in Spanish. Okay. So we have already entered translanguaging. Maybe we should have had something in Bangla as well. Yeah. What? Yeah, the Bangla. Yes, I would love to translate the Bangla. for the benefit of the audience. But thank you for a very spirited and passionate keynote address. Usually keynotes are rather sober and subdued, but you have added a passionate dimension. And I would also like to thank, is that a local version of the swallow? A magpie? Yeah. Which kept accompaniment for half the time. You see? So the bird is still there, and I hope it will also accompany some of the other speakers. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Azfar Hussain, for the keynote speech, and we are always, always animated by the animated speech that Azfar sir gives. And thank you to Professor Kaiser Haq, the Dean of School of Humanities, School of Arts and Humanities, for chairing the session. Can I request the head of the department, Ms. Arifa Guniraman, on the stage, please, to hand over our token of appreciation. First of all, I would like to request Ms. Arifa to hand over to our keynote speaker, Professor Azfar Hussain, and also to hand over to our session chair, Professor Kaiser Haq. Thank you so much, Ms. Arifa Guniraman, the session chair, and also the keynote speaker.